Nazi methods of control, government and opposition. This is podcast 2, which is focusing on the aspect of fear and terror, the way in which the Nazis controlled the population using intimidation. Use the same mind map that we used for the first podcast. Obviously here we are focusing on this particular strand in the bottom right hand corner, so map out from the various branches and fingers the essential facts, the hard facts, making sure that you actually write along the strands and that you don't write sentences. And again, a reminder then, put those key facts onto flashcards, index cards, post-it notes and stick them on the wall so you're looking at them regularly as a way of helping you remember the information. Okay, so let's begin. This is the area which students will usually go straight for if they're asked how did the Nazis control the German population. And just that word of warning, which I mentioned yesterday, try to avoid talking in extremes. It's really important to remember that particularly in the early years, say 1933 when Hitler came to power up to about 1936-37, the Nazis were genuinely popular with many German people. Not all German people, obviously communists and socialists and Jews were victims of violence and were persecuted, but many Germans genuinely supported the Nazis. Remember the vote of March 1933, which was just 5 or 6 weeks after Hitler became Chancellor. 44% of Germans voted for the Nazis, and that was largely without intimidation. It was mainly because they genuinely believed that Hitler was bringing unity and strength to the nation. Remember what we know eventually happened, the awful things he did, taking Germany into war, and in particular the extreme violence against the Jews. That was something that the German people didn't know was going to happen. That they knew that Hitler disliked the Jews, that was certainly well known, but there's no evidence at all that Hitler himself even knew what he was going to do with the Jews at this particular stage. So I use the image of a wolf in sheep's clothing. Hitler, to a large extent, disguised his long-term aims, in particular his plans to go to war. Most German people did not want to go to war. They simply wanted to have a leader who would bring about a restoration of national honour, to challenge Versailles and to get the restrictions of the Treaty of Versailles lifted without having to go to war to do that. So genuine popularity. Nevertheless, having said that, the Nazis did use intimidation and fear right from the word go, although in the early years it was mainly used against socialists and communists. Okay, so our starting point is obviously the Nazis were a dictatorship. They wanted total willing obedience from people. Many people would support them anyway, without intimidation in the early years. Okay, to a large extent, Hitler in 1933 knew that there was a whole generation of Germans, the adult generation, who had grown up and had gone through the Weimar Republic, and therefore Hitler never really trusted the adult generation. He knew that the real future of Germany lay with the children, because they were like a blank sheet of paper waiting to be written on. So in Hitler's view, because he couldn't trust the adults, he knew that he had to have very restrictive laws. And remember, he can pass laws by himself with the Enabling Act, and terror. He's got the SS. Remember that the police have been taken over by the Nazis, and indoctrination. Because of the Enabling Act, he's now got the power to take control over the media, and use the great skills of the Nazis of propaganda to indoctrinate the German people. Okay, so how did fear work? Well, most people would say the Gestapo actually For the majority of Germans, they never ever came across the Gestapo. The Gestapo were a relatively small group of people. What the Nazis really relied on was like local, what we call block wardens. Um, like a local Nazi, Hitler tried to put a Nazi on every street, and that Nazi would look at, effectively watch over the households on that street. On average, it would be about 40 households for each block warden. And the block warden was really like a Nazi snitch, a sneak, somebody who would keep an eye on people, make sure that they were not moaning, making jokes against Hitler, for example. And if they did, the block warden would report that person, or would threaten to report that person to the Gestapo. So people lived in intimidation. There weren't enough Gestapo policemen around to arrest people who cracked all these jokes, but on the whole, it did work. Most people would tend to find that if they did make a joke against Hitler and the block warden reported them, probably what would happen is you'd find your promotion at work blocked, things like that. So on the whole, sort of grumblers and people who made sort of like jokes about Hitler were not put in concentration camps, but they would find that their life would be made more difficult in subtle ways. So that was what the block wardens are about. The Gestapo then, okay, well the Gestapo were feared, they were the secret police. The leader of the Gestapo there, you can see his photograph, was Chief Muller. They dealt with what we call political crimes. Now, what was a political crime? Well, a political crime was anybody who basically opposed the Nazis. Now, in the early years, the main political criminals were the communists and the socialists. So they were picked up by the Gestapo, they were handed over to the SS, and they were basically put into special prisons called concentration camps. These were special prisons for political prisoners, people who disagreed with the Nazi regime. Remember, that absolutely central to the Nazism was unity. All Germans should support the Nazi party, so anybody who didn't had committed a political crime. So what a concentration camp was a special prison that would concentrate political prisoners together in one place, that's where the name came from, so that their dangerous ideas would not infect good, loyal Germans who supported the Nazis, so that they were isolated from the rest of from ordinary German people. Once in a concentration camp, it was very difficult to get out. The very first concentration camps were put up very quickly in disused buildings, mainly factories that had closed down during the Great Depression. Simply they put barbed wire around the factories, and that's where the first socialists and communists were put. But it didn't take long for the Nazis to build a purpose-built concentration camp, and the first one was in the just outside the German city of the German city of Munich, and it was called Dachau, Dachau, and that opened in June 1933. It was the model concentration camp. The Nazis built many, many more, including in Poland during World War II, but they were all modelled on the same design and the way in which they were run from Dachau. Brutal places. Many people would be killed, just randomly killed, in concentration camps, but mainly just put to hard labour. They did not have gassing facilities. They did not have gas chambers at this time. Okay, and that's an important point to remember. They were just very, very brutal prisons in Germany. Now, who went to concentration camps in the early years? Political prisoners. Okay, as time went on, more and more people were sent to concentration camp, what we call the undesirables. Who were the undesirables? Well, the undesirables were people who the Nazis felt were weakening the nation in various ways. So, for example, beggars were undesirables. Why? Because they were not contributing to the strength of the nation. They were not working. The disabled, for similar reasons. The Nazis viewed people with disabilities as burdens. Good Germans should be working, contributing to making the nation stronger, and they shouldn't be looking after the weak. So the Nazis despised the weak. Sexual offenders like homosexuals, prostitutes. The Nazis were very, very intolerant of sexual deviancy, as it was known. They believed that good Germans should be reproducing, having children, living a very healthy, natural lifestyle, and that sex was not something to be enjoyed. It was about producing children. Homosexuals, prostitutes were often put into concentration camps. Religious groups, we'll do this on the next podcast, but many priests were put into concentration camps. And then you've got the other groups here, black people, gypsies and Jewish people. Now these were racial undesirables. They were despised because of their blood, because of their biological makeup. Now in the early years, certainly in the first 4 or 5 years that Hitler was leader of Germany, on the whole, these groups were not put into concentration camps. The Nazis despised them. There were Jews in concentration camps, but they were Jews who were socialists, or they were Jews who were beggars. But in the early years, you were not put into concentration camps just for being a Jew. That happened later. So that finishes this second podcast about fear. Again, as with the first podcast, pause at this point, have a go at these questions, and then move on to the next slide, which I'll move to in a second, which gives the answers. So here are the answers to those questions. Thank you. There are 4 more podcasts in this series, which will be on YouTube.